Assalamu alaikum. I'm Carl Arrindell and you're watching In Focus. Now I'm delighted to be joined today in the run-up to the elections on 8th of June by Andrew Slaughter. Andrew Slaughter was formerly the leader of the London Borough of Hammersmith and Fulham Council. He has been a Labour Party member of Parliament since 2005 when he won the seat for Ealing, Acton and Shepherd's Bush. Following boundary changes, he was elected as a Member of Parliament for Hammersmith in the 2010 elections. His interests are listed as including the Middle East and particularly Palestine, which he has visited on several occasions. He is a secretary of the Britain-Palestine All-Party Parliamentary Group and vice chair of the Labour Friends of Palestine and the Middle East. He is the Labour Party's prospective candidate for Hammersmith and Fulham in the 8th of June elections, which are just less than 3 weeks away. Assalamu alaikum, Andrew, and welcome to In Focus. Now, the Labour Party officially launched its manifesto for this election earlier this week, amid predictions even from Len McCluskey, the General Secretary of the Unite Union and one of the Labour Party's biggest donors, that it cannot possibly win the election against the tide of hostile media against its leader, Jeremy Corbyn. He said that if it manages to retain 200 seats, which incidentally would be the worst performance since essentially the war, that it will have done well in its campaign. The Labour Party has undergone radical change. Nobody really can deny that under the leadership of Jeremy Corbyn. And I'm aware that last year you yourself resigned your position as Shadow Justice Minister in Corbyn Cabinet. Now, two polls out today indicate that since publication of the manifesto, Labour has taken a leap in its ratings, gaining 8 points, but still leaving the Conservatives with a substantial 15-point lead. At that level, that would possibly mean Labour with just 175 seats. Do you agree with McCluskey's prediction that a return of less than 200 means a disaster for the Labour Party? And do you blame this on a hostile media or failures of the leadership?
Well, to be fair to Len, who has a lot of experience, as you say, he's the leader of the biggest trade union in the country. I think he has revised his opinion as well. I don't know whether he was having a bad day. It must have been all the terrible weather we've been having recently, but he's cheered up a lot and is predicting that we will do actually much better than that. And as you say, the polls have moved substantially in our favour. Now, they had to do that because we were very behind, and that may be what led to predictions of gloom. And I think the other thing that possibly has been depressing people on our side is this media onslaught, which you referred to, which I've not seen anything like. Now, Labour leaders always get the rough end of the stick from the media, but nothing to the extent that we've been seeing now. And I think partly that was because we hadn't seen the substance from both parties, and therefore it was all conjecture or going over old ground. What's changed, I think, both in the polls, substantial leap, long way to go, but also in the attitude of the party, the positivity of the party, is that now both parties, Conservative and Labour, are fighting on a platform, and it's pretty clear, I'm sure we're going to go into this in more detail, that the Labour platform is one of hope, it's a radical programme, and it's saying many of the things that people have wanted to hear from politicians for many years. And the Conservative one, and it's the most extraordinary manifesto I've seen in my political life, is effectively saying, these are the ways we're going to punish you. Now, I don't know if they're setting out to narrow the gap or to lose the election, but it's a good way to do it.
I'm glad to see that you're so optimistic, Andrew. Now, moving on to the issue of Brexit. I know you were one of the 47 Labour MPs who defied the whip on Brexit, that vote to trigger Article 50. You said, I think Brexit, and in particular May's hard Brexit, out of the single market, out of the customs union, cozying up to dictatorships in a desperate effort to replace the lost European trade, is a disaster for our country on social, economic, cultural and security terms. Why is Brexit such a disaster for our country? And was the Labour Party leadership's decision to try and impose a whip a mistake?
Well, I am, as you say, a passionate pro-European, and I think it was a disaster the way the country voted. And we will see that not in a overnight, because after all we're going to be in the EU for almost another 2 years, but as a gradual economic decline of the country. And I think many people will get buyer's remorse. They will regret those decisions. Having said that, and despite all the lies and misrepresentation about £350 million a week for the NHS that the Brexiteers promised, the country did vote, albeit narrowly, to leave. And I respect that position, and therefore I respect the position that Jeremy Corbyn and Keir Starmer, our excellent Brexit spokesman, have taken on that. So why did I, despite that, defy the whip? Because I asked Theresa May and Prime Minister's questions. When you've negotiated your deal, when you know the terms on which we're leaving, will you allow Parliament to have a full say on that? Or would you allow the British people, perhaps by way of a second referendum, not to revisit the decision, but to decide whether they thought the terms were acceptable or not? And she said very clearly, no, and she's made it very clear she's going to what in the common parlance is the hard Brexit, i.e. one that completely cuts us off from Europe and our major trading partners. On that basis, I didn't feel in the interests of my constituents, who are very pro-Remain, that I could in all conscience go and vote for that process happening.
So where does that leave you now? I mean, there were talks at one point, I know there were wild talks, of London going independent and asking for an independence referendum. Now, where does it leave people like you? Most of the London MPs followed suit and defied the whip. What do you do now? Do you just go along with it reluctantly?
UDI, or going independent, it's quite attractive when we've got Sadiq Khan as one of the best politicians in the country, and somebody who, like me, is passionate about keeping those links with Europe, because for London, in terms of the financial sector, in terms of trade, but also in terms of the sort of society we want to be, 1 in 6 of my constituents is an EU national from one of the other 27 countries. Almost 50% of my constituents were born outside the UK. And I can tell you, because I think one of the tricks that the Tories tried was to try and turn non-EU immigrants against EU immigrants. And it certainly didn't work. It certainly didn't work in Hammersmith and in London, because people from around the world saw that the sort of attacks and the attitudes they were seeing from the extreme Brexiteers towards European citizens could equally well be used against them. Now,
you said that, these are your words, that Brexit is a distraction from the more urgent and more dramatic collapse of our public services.
Yes.
So I'll take you on your word and move on.
Yes.
Let's talk about the collapse of the public services. You've spoken out against plans by this Conservative government to close down hospitals, departments across England, with their so-called sustainability and transformation plan. They say that these proposals are place-based and built around the needs of local populations. I know that you've been involved in a campaign locally to save the Charing Cross Hospital in your own constituency, with their plans to downsize it, would effectively by 75%. You consistently argue that the NHS needs to be properly funded. Is Labour's manifesto's pledge to inject £30 billion into the NHS the answer? And will it mean an end to hospital closures?
Yes. Well, alongside those pledges, separately, Jonathan Ashworth, who's our excellent health spokesman, has said that we will halt those closures and we will review those STPs, as they call wonderful Orwellian phrases, sustainability and transformation, for which you can read cuts and closures. and we're absolutely in the firing line. West London was the guinea pig for this. We've actually been fighting the closures of A&E departments and the demolition of whole hospitals. In my case, the famous Charing Cross Hospital, one of the best in the country, one of the biggest in the country, which is facing almost complete destruction, demolition and replacement with effectively primary care services. So you can understand why that's top of my list of issues on public services. There are many others. But yes, Labour has said that it will stop and review that programme, and secondly, that it will inject the money that health service needs, because a lot of these closures, whatever they dress them up as, are driven by cuts and by tightening budgets.
Now, you say about Labour injecting the money that the health service needs. According to the Health Foundation, which is an independent charity, the NHS spend, for example, will still leave a £7 billion funding gap by 2020. And it also points out that the pledge is around half of the recommendations by the Independent Office for Budget Responsibility's projection for funding pressures on the service. So should Labour be doing more?
Well, I think Labour will be doing more, because the way that we see this, and this is not a new policy, this is something which Andy Burnham campaigned on, but which is something we still believe in, is joining up the whole health and social care process, because a big part of the problem is not just the money for acute services, for ambulances, for emergency surgeries, for A&Es, or indeed even for primary care. It's about dealing with particularly elderly people and people with long-term needs and ensuring that they have proper care. And this is where we've seen the Conservatives, I think, at their worst, because they have failed singularly. They cut 50% of local authority budgets, and it's local authorities have to fund that social care. And now in their manifesto, I go back to talking about punishing people, they're saying, right, if you want care, even in your own home, you pay for it yourself, or we will impose what is now being called the dementia tax, and is really a form of death tax, i.e. we will take all your money, or all but a small part of your money, and make you pay for it yourselves. So yes, Labour will ensure that we have a cradle-to-grave service in that way in terms of health, but also we are resistant to that, to effectively stripping away the few assets that people have built up over their lifetime.
Okay, then let's talk about housing. You previously accused the local Tory-led council of exacerbating an already serious problem, you said, by pursuing policies which actively contributed to the housing crisis in the borough. It has been a Labour control since June 2014. Have things improved as a consequence? And is there still a housing crisis in Hammersmith? The former Tory leader of the council argued that Labour's obsession with rented housing is misguided when local demand is for homes to buy. Yeah. Is Labour misguided or is he?
Well, if the health service is a critical, it needs critical care, housing is the chronic issue for London and certainly for expensive areas like West London. And let's be fair, there have been housing problems and more demand than there has been supply over many, many years. My objection, which you quoted there, is that rather than try and make that better, the Conservatives were making that worse. They were selling off council properties when they were empty. They were actually going out of their way not to build affordable homes, not asking developers to provide genuinely affordable homes. Now that is changing partly because in Sadiq Khan we've got a mayor who is prioritising affordable housing. But to answer your specific question about Hammersmith, on day one that Labour was elected, they stopped the sales programme and they've now started a building programme. The problem is these things take time to turn around. So yes, there are 600 new council homes in the pipeline, but that is only beginning to change things around. But you have to start somewhere. And yes, I'm afraid to say that there is a long way to go. And we have problems in the private rented sector where there are some terrible landlords and people living in terrible conditions. And there are young people and families waiting to get on the home ownership ladder who are priced out of the market. All three of those, and I will stop talking about this because I'm the Shadow Housing Minister, I've gone all night about this. All three of those areas are a priority and Labour is just about to launch its housing manifesto, which I've had a hand in drafting, and you will see in that some new policies to deal with all those issues.
Does that mean that all those plans that we heard about prior to Labour taking over the council of £8 billion regeneration of the Earl's Court 77-acre site, or the 7,500 homes and jobs, and the 1 billion redevelopment of the BBC Television Centre in White City, or even the 200 million reconstruction of the Riverside Studios, has that all been put on ice, or what's happening with all those?
I mean, sadly, the Conservatives were in power in Hammersmith for 8 years. They handed out planning permissions with no gain for local residents. So we are having these skyscrapers of luxury flats, many of which are sold to investors and which remain empty and are really an appalling thing to see on the skyline when you have people living next door to them in council houses who are overcrowded or in a state of real need. So to some extent, we have been unable to stop that because that was already given permission. But where we have been able to delay things, or where we are able now to intervene, and I say, and again, the mayor is important in this, we are demanding a minimum of a third, hopefully 50% genuinely affordable housing. And so, yes, that will change over time, so long as there's Labour administrations here.
Now, Labour has pledged, we've been talking about Hammersmith, so let's just talk on a national level on housing. Labour has pledged to build over 1 million new homes over 5 years, with at least 500,000 of those being council houses. There's a pledge to end as they say, insecurity for private renters by introducing rent control, secure tenancies, and an increase in affordable home ownership. It is estimated that will cost upwards of £7 billion a year. Now, the manifesto itself doesn't actually include, strangely enough, any sort of costings for this. These are outside estimates. All in all, Labour's manifesto pledges seem to go beyond £50 billion. Do you believe that the numbers stack up, and will the books balance?
Yes. Well, interestingly, and John, the Shadow Chancellor, has been very clear about this, the numbers do stack up, and I think probably because we had to, because we were under so much scrutiny, there is an analysis, and we do show our workings in the manifesto. And we were slightly surprised, therefore, when the Tory manifesto came out, that there was no workings at all. These were simply aspirations. And the very first thing they were challenged on, which is the repetition of their rather unwise suggestion that they will get down immigration into the tens of thousands, which has a massive potential cost, because immigration is beneficial in financial terms to the country and in many other ways. And when they were asked about that, they said, we don't know when we're going to do it, so we don't know how much it will cost. Imagine the Labour Party saying something like that. We will be roasted.
Well, you have to admit that this is the first time we've seen, I think, any party publishing its costings in a separate document. So it was quite revolutionary for Labour to take that step.
But to go back to the housing point, just to be more specific on those issues, on the private rented sector, it is vitally important that we have more inspection, more control and more prosecution of bad landlords. We are seeing people living in shoe boxes that are subdivided, we are seeing beds in sheds, we're seeing evictions simply because the landlords think that they can get more rent from another tenant in that way. So we are saying longer tenancies, we're saying rent controls within those tenancies, and we're saying licensing schemes for all landlords. But that won't actually cost a lot of money, because what money it does cost will be a small levy on the landlords to fund the scheme. The same thing in relation to much of the cost of new affordable housing will come through planning gain. On the Council and Housing Association housing, that has to be built stepped up. So we're talking about, by the end of the 5 years, building about 250,000 homes a year. So the million is over 5 years, but it builds up in steps. And about 100,000 of those in that last year would be either council housing association or genuinely affordable. Because actually in London, the only type of housing that is affordable to people on the London living wage, which is about £10 an hour now, is social housing. Private rented sector and owner occupation are outside the reach of people. That's how bad it's got.
Now, can we move on to the broader issue of poverty in the UK? Reports suggest that 22% of the population are living in the UK's most deprived areas. Figures revealed at the end of last year by the All Parties Parliamentary group on hunger showed that food bank usage, which had already reached unprecedented levels, with an estimated 2 million emergency food packages being distributed last year, with recipients including many working families and NHS workers. The APPG found that insecure work arrangements, high living costs were key drivers of that poverty. Your own Shadow Environment, Food and Rural Affairs spokesman, Kerry McCarthy, I think she described the situation as a national scandal. Do you believe Labour's plans to reverse benefit caps, unfreeze working age benefits and inject £10 billion into the benefit system over the next 5 years will be enough to wipe out the use of the food banks?
I do believe that. Hammersmith has been said to be one of the best areas for supporting food banks. The council, and I do a lot of work with them personally, and the operation is superb, and the help that's given and the locations and the venues, and in addition supplying advice through our law centre and other things of that kind. But in a way I'm ashamed that we have to do that in the 21st century we have food banks. In the same way that I'm ashamed that since the Tories got in 2010, homelessness has gone up by 130%, when under the last 10 years of the Labour government it fell by 75%. What all that says to me is that these raw problems, these are the symptoms of the malaise in our society, but they're actually not that difficult to resolve if you have the will and some finance. But it doesn't cost a fortune. We have in this country just over 4,000 people sleeping rough every night. Now that's appalling. Every single one of those is a tragedy. But we can resolve that problem. We've promised to resolve that problem within one Parliament. So yes, I think what we're saying in relation to that, and you're absolutely right to say that there is a causal link between those benefit cuts and pushing families into poverty by things like the bedroom tax and what we now see, which is a degree of desperation and poverty and hunger that we haven't seen in this country probably since the Second World War.
Unemployment is an issue that's totally related to what we've just been talking about. And a recent report by the Council of Mosques in Bradford served to highlight what they saw of the big issues, and unemployment was high amongst them, especially with the diminishing opportunities in the traditional manufacturing industries, which used to be the mainstay of immigrants who, when they first arrived in Britain. Now, statistics show that unemployment rates amongst Muslims are more than double that of the national average. You've got 12.8% of Muslims unemployed and 5.4% is the national average. How important is addressing the issue of unemployment more broadly, but also discrimination in the workplace?
I think the question of unemployment has moved on a lot, say from the 1980s, when we had mass unemployment across the board under the Thatcher government. Now, you could look at the headline figures and say, well, actually, it's not too bad compared with some other developed countries. But what that hides is exactly the point you're making, which is under certain groups of people, there are much higher rates of unemployment, and that could be young people, long-term unemployed, or it could be from BME or minority groups. And that clearly creates real concerns of its own. But there's also a concern about what type of work people have, because those unemployment figures would be much higher if we didn't have this massive growth in what's called the gig economy, i.e. 0 hours contracts, unstable employment, very low paid employment, just about on the minimum wage.
The very same people who are going to the food banks.
Exactly. And poverty for people in work is the new rising trend. It is just as bad as we had before, where you had mass unemployment, because here are people who are working. Some people have 2 or 3 jobs, or they have jobs that they don't know when they're going to be available or not. That, and I'm pleased to say that Labour has a number of pledges on that to reverse that. We don't just want people to have jobs, and we don't want just fairness across all parts of society, and certainly I'm very concerned about what you say in terms of unemployment amongst the Muslim community, but we want good jobs, and we want jobs that will be lasting for people, and that's what we're not seeing.
Now, the same Council of Mosques in Bradford, on their list of priorities that they saw for the Muslim community more broadly, was the issue of the widespread feeling that Muslims were being treated as a suspect community, the whole issue of the menace of terrorism. And they cited PREVENT, the PREVENT strategy, as a significant source of tension. Do you think that the level of scrutiny, the new very harsh legislation that was introduced only last year on the terrorism laws, the new powers that have been given, should be done away with? Should the PREVENT programme be completely revisited, at least in its current format?
Well, I was on a select committee, the Communities and Local Government Select Committee, about 10 years ago now, when we did a review of PREVENT then, and came up with some pretty strong recommendations that it simply wasn't working. And we didn't say, get rid of it and replace it with nothing. We said this needs a comprehensive review, and I don't think we've ever had that review. What we have is tinkering and people trying out new things and new ideas. But the whole purpose of something like PREVENT is you have to have the confidence of communities. And I'm afraid that either the elements of it, or the way it's been presented, or the people who have been advocating it, it has to a large extent lost confidence. So we have to go back, and the key is working with the Muslim community, but not just the Muslim community, all communities, to ensure that, because there is no difference in the attitude that people have to terrorism, to civil liberties, to threats to our national security in that way, or simply to living in a safe society. I don't know any difference between any community. Everybody wants to see that, but somehow, particularly under the Conservatives, you've had this divide and rule, and I think that's the problem. It's not helping things, it's exacerbating the problem.
Now, I must not exclude the issue of education. It's a big issue. It's a big issue that has prompted the Labour manifesto to inject £25 billion into providing, doing away of tuition fees, restoring the education maintenance allowance, funding the limiting of class sizes. Labour says it will not waste money on inefficient free schools, and it dismisses the grammar schools as a conservative vanity project.
Yes.
Wonderful description. These proposals, I quote, simply, as far as David Gauck, the Conservative Party Chief Secretary to the Treasury, he says that these proposals simply don't add up, and that every single working family in this country would pay for Corbyn's chaos with higher taxes. Now, will that £25 billion of money be well spent? And will these plans place an unnecessary burden on ordinary working people?
The education policies are getting some of the best response on the doorstep, and they really are a breath of fresh air. I think the burden of tuition fees has now got so high that it is discouraging young people from going to university. But if they do go, they are then having an extraordinary burden put upon them. But we've also got, for the first time in a generation, substantial cuts in schools' budgets. Some of the schools in my constituency have had cuts of up to 25% over a period of years. That means they lose teachers, it means they have overcrowded classes, it means they don't have the equipment and supplies, the books that they need. That's unthinkable, really, in the modern age. So there's a very warm reception from families, whether they have school-age children or they're thinking about their children going to university. And I think in many ways, I know there's something that Jeremy Corbyn himself cares very passionately about learning, about education and about equal chances, which is why, again, we are very against the increase in grammar school. We want every school to be a good school. So again, it is fully costed. It does come from reverses some of the tax cuts on wealthy people and on corporations that the Tories introduced. And I think that is exactly the right thing to do in itself, but also because you're then building a prosperous society for the future. You're building people across the spectrum, wherever their background, who have the skills to get good jobs.
Well, on that very positive note, Andrew Slaughter, prospective Labour MP for Hammersmith and Fulham, thank you very much for joining me on Islam Channel.
Thank you very much, Carl.